welcome back to the podcast and our radio show here at Bobo 89.1 FM. I am Bella Rooney, your host, and today we are continuing our new series called Nature Positive, which is sponsored by Sustainable Cayman. So each month we have been talking to new guests on a different subject relating to a move towards nature positivity. Last month we met with Courtney Platt and chatted about fisheries and the role that they play with our reef and populations and the role that plays in the future of Cayman. And so make sure you check that out wherever you get your podcasts and over on YouTube. This month, we're sitting down with Senior Policy Advisor at the Ministry of Sustainability and Climate Resiliency, Miss Lisa Hurlston-McKenzie. I love that grand last name. To chat a little bit about climate change. So, hey, Lisa, how are you?
I'm good, Bella. Thank you very much for having me on.
Well, thanks for joining us today. This is a very big topic.
Yes, it is.
It's kind of hard to encompass it in just one conversation.
That's true.
But we're going to cover the basics, kind of just the understanding, lay the foundation for people to kind of then go on and do their own research into the subject. So, you have an absolutely amazing background working with people like RSPB, which is the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, working with the National Trust as the National Trust and as the Director of Cayman Offsets. And Cayman Offsets, just in case people aren't familiar, is an NPO that works to ease the transition to renewable energy future for the Cayman Islands by helping to finance and expense changes to existing infrastructure, like increasing awareness of existing alternatives and other interesting stuff like that. So it's super cool, super interesting stuff, super important stuff, and makes you the right person to give us the 411 on climate change. So,
boy,
I'm sorry.
No pressure there.
No, it's okay. I'm sweating too. It's okay. So before we dive in, I'd love to get to know you a bit better. How did you become passionate about this, and how have you found yourself in the position today at the ministry?
Oh boy, okay. Yes, I will probably be dating myself here in terms of my journey, but I guess I would have to say that it probably started at an age not dissimilar to yours, or maybe slightly younger, when I was doing my first degree, and that was round about the time of the world-famous Earth Summit in Rio in 1992. So I guess there's the baseline. No. There's the date.
Age's wisdom.
But as many of you out there who know about the Earth Summit and sort of what fell out of that, which was none other than the the discussion about sustainable development. At its very basis, and the forest principles and the Agenda 21 that came out of that landmark summit, and of course we've had two since then, marking the 10, 20, and I suppose now even the 30 year anniversary of that summit, but also the landmark sort of quote unquote conventions or treaties that fell out of that, one of which was the climate change framework, the UN climate change framework on climate change, on Convention on Climate Change, but also the Convention on Biological Diversity. And the two have since been trying to work together to address what I suppose a lot of people nowadays call, the twin crises that, the globe is facing in terms of the climate emergency as well as the biodiversity loss, and trying to halt or at least reduce the rate of both of those things happening. So that was around about that time. So I was learning about it in uni, in school anyway, but also in the summers I was working with the Mosquito Research and Control Unit here. And I was very much interested in the climate change impacts on vector-borne diseases like dengue fever or malaria. So then fast forward a few years, when I got to university to do my master's degree, I was really invested in the subject by that time, and particularly on the human health side of things, dealing with dengue and other vector-borne diseases. But unfortunately, I didn't actually have a thesis supervisor to supervise any of my work. So whilst I did continue to study it, I didn't end up doing my master's thesis on that. But then fast forward a few years later, when I was working at the Department of Environment, which I spent about 13 or 14 years there, and a few years into my civil service career, we partnered with an individual out of the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research, which is based in the UK at the University of East Anglia. And she and I became co-authors along with a number of other people throughout the years, on our climate change work, which was primarily focused on adaptation research, and what people can do to lessen their vulnerability to climate change, either at an individual, household, community level, business level, and obviously on up through to the national scale. So that, in a nutshell, is sort of my journey over the last 28 years.
Wow, that's a lot. That's a lot. And I mean, I guess that you've seen all the big changes that have been happening, all the momentum behind it that's been growing, and now I guess we find ourselves here today, which is really good that we're talking about it. And I know we have other things coming up with the government in terms of our climate change here. So before we get into all that too, let's just start with kind of a basic question on what is climate change? What does it mean? Because some people may still call it global warming, but why is climate change the correct term?
Climate change is the correct term because it encapsulates so much more than global warming. Global warming and its converse, global cooling, are two components of climate change, the yin and the yang, so to speak. And we just happen to be, for the last 10,000 odd years, coming out of a cooling period, for the entire world, based on when the last ice age supposedly ended, and into a warming period. So that's a natural cycle of the Earth. But the sort of global warming craze and coining of the phrase really came as a result of all of the overwhelming scientific information that is now out there, has been out there for several decades now, not least of which by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, that have been putting together these assessment reports, probably starting from, I believe it was like 1988. So we're now on to our sixth assessment report as a global community. And, where the evidence base year upon year and report upon report has just been building, that whilst we might be in this natural cycle of warming, we definitely are seeing what they call a human signature, or an anthropogenic signature to climate change, or to the global warming aspect of climate change, starting, no surprise really, from the start of the Industrial Revolution back in like 1750, 1800s, thereabouts, certainly at least in Europe, in the global north, so to speak, but also more recently in and around 1950, when we had better methods of recording not just air temperature data and sea temperatures, but also things like sea level rise, measured not just through tide gauge and long-term tide gauge information and data sets, but also through satellite telemetry, where we can, look down on the Earth and measure to almost minutia, the fact that the sea levels are rising and rising at slightly different rates depending on where you are, around the globe and in different ocean basins and that sort of thing. So the global warming is not inaccurate, but it doesn't capture all of what climate change is. And then obviously beyond the science itself, climate change captures basically that climatic conditions are changing, weather patterns are becoming more unpredictable. And what does that mean for you and I? What does that mean for other people around the world, that are going about their daily lives, whether they're working in an office but have to travel to and from work, and they're finding, heavier rainfall patterns and flooding that has got worse over the years and over the course of their, typical journey to work, or that, areas are flooding in places that have never flooded before, for example, or if you work outside and it's just, getting hotter and you have to be, concerned about your hydration levels and your sun exposure and your heat exposure, and our clinics and hospitals seeing more incidences of heat stress that we have to deal with, that's adding to the cost of healthcare, for example, or are we seeing damage to particular economic sectors, such as agriculture and tourism in the Caribbean in particular, which are extremely climate sensitive economic sectors, and upon which thousands, hundreds of thousands, even millions of people's livelihoods depend. So, it's not an estimation or putting the fear of death in people, really, to say that climate change, is just something into the future because it's happening now, we know that, but also that it is going to impact every facet of our life, or it is impacting every facet of our lives already. It's just that some people or some groups or some countries may be more vulnerable to those changes than others because either they're already in a state of being vulnerable just to normal, like I said, day-to-day weather that will be exacerbated by climate change, or that they just have more of a wherewithal to be able to address those impacts and what they can do going forward to improve their daily lives or their economic situations. And so climate change maybe is less of a issue for them, at least in the forefront of their minds, because it might not necessarily change the way they go about their daily lives or perform their functions or operate their businesses. But it is something for people to start thinking about.
Right. I agree fully with everything you just said. Yeah, it's very much present. It's very hard to see, I think because it moves on such here maybe it's hard to see. If you look around the world and you open your eyes to global news and what's happening, it's a bit easier to see. But if you're just living here and you're in your bubble, which we sometimes tend to be here in Cayman, our island bubble, it's harder to see. So, and some people might not even understand why it's happening, right? So I wonder if you could tell us exactly what the main cause of climate change is. So I know we mentioned the natural cycles, right, that happen roughly every 100,000 years, something like that. But like you mentioned, the Industrial Revolution, what about the Industrial Revolution is causing this? Carbon is really what I'm getting at here, right? So, what is it about climate change? What's making climate change happen?
Well, there's a couple of different what they call climate drivers to climate change, but as you rightly say, it's how much carbon for the most part. There are other greenhouse gases which we can talk about that's being put into the atmosphere as a result of manufacturing of various different products that we use every single day. This microphone, this desk, my reusable water bottle, like everything obviously takes energy to produce. And that energy for several hundreds of years have primarily been produced through the mining and extraction and distribution of coal to coal-fired power plants all over the world, as well as, the use of diesel fossil fuel, which is primarily what we use here in the Cayman Islands to, power our power stations and, be able to fortunately turn the lights on, have AC systems, that sort of thing. So that's the primary cause of the majority of what we have put into our atmosphere as a result of our human activities, like I said, since the start of the Industrial Revolution, which, of course, as you can appreciate, the amount of people we had on the planet back then versus how many people we have now, and the rate of population growth, which, is paired with economic activity and the production of goods and services, as I said. So that all sort of is primarily driving climate change. But, there's other things that sort of go along with that. Yeah. In terms of creating more cities, creating more farms, whether they're for arable crops or whether they're for rearing cattle for beef, the beef industry or what have you. So we typically see that happening in areas that once were forests and now are converted to other land uses, whether it's for, cities or urban areas or agricultural uses, as I said. And that is typically called deforestation. So in the process of deforestation, usually it's slash and burn. So that means you're burning, yet again, the carbon that's been locked up or sequestered on an annual basis from very old growth forests in particular. And all of us, I think, remember, even when we were younger, the issue about the Amazon rainforest and being the lungs of the earth. And then we've since, identified that there are other important forests throughout the world as well. But that's, the biggie, that's the primary one. And many countries around the world are trying different sort of mechanisms to help Brazil in particular, preserve the Amazon rainforest, but still allow their their people to have a quality of life and the same amount of, or maybe not the same amount of, but still have progress and economic growth, but maybe in a different way than how other countries around the world, achieved that level of development and economic prosperity. But then, so I think maybe some other people will also know or also have heard about, cows.
Methane.
Right, the methane production, which the official term is called enteric fermentation. Yep, but I think we all know what that means. And yes, it is the production of methane that they expel. And yeah, again, so that's tied to livestock rearing and agricultural production. You say, well, what's one cow? But when you think of, the industry on a global scale, and like I said, when it's paired with how, that land use for that purpose actually came to be, whether they had to cut down a forest to do it and whether they had to burn that forest in order to cut it down, that sort of thing. So there's that, and methane is a much more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, and it's naturally occurring as well. So whilst it might not have the same sort of volume of concentrations in the atmosphere, the fact that it is more potent over its lifespan than CO2, that's what the consideration is. It's along with a few others like anthropogenic black carbon and the HFCs, the hydrofluorocarbon. Those are what's called short-lived climate pollutants. So they're shorter lived in the atmosphere than carbon dioxide, but they're more potent when they're in the atmosphere. So and I think I saw that you had attended COP27, so you may remember hearing about the methane pledge, for example, and the fact that, methane does contribute to global warming and to climate change. So equally focusing on these short-lived gases like methane and trying to reduce and or avoid them getting into the atmosphere or even into the oceans is just as important as dealing with the carbon dioxide issue and the sources of carbon dioxide, because the effect on the climate system and being able to sort of slow, climate change and to slow down what's already, for lack of a better term, baked into our climate processes because of the amount of emissions that we've put into the atmosphere over 250 years or so, plus what's naturally occurring there, of course, that will have a somewhat more immediate effect on being able to potentially arrest some of those processes. So that's why methane and some of these short-lived but potent greenhouse gases are just as important to tackle when it comes to climate change as carbon dioxide.
Yeah, there's a lot. The chemistry of the atmosphere is quite...
Yes, and I'm not a climate scientist by any measure of the imagination, but, the sources of some of these gases, apart from methane, but like the HFCs, the F gases that I spoke about, they are things that are found in refrigerants, so our cooling systems, whether they're commercial cooling systems, industrial cooling systems, or even our household air conditioners, in blowing agents for spray foam and fire retardants. So, whilst we obviously don't produce these things here, for example, in a small island like the Cayman Islands, but we use these products. So it's not just the emissions from the production of these products and the raw materials that go into all of these, but it's also in terms of some of these gases, the uses of them that still end up getting into the atmosphere and adding to the global concentrations. And at the end of the day, it doesn't matter, right, where these emissions are coming from per se, because it all gets up into the global stratosphere, right, the same place. So that's why it's important for us all to do, our best, yes, to work together to reduce them. Now, obviously, there are some very clear sources of where these emissions are coming from, obviously the larger industrial nations of the world, but that's not to say that we aren't contributing to the overall problem as well.
I was actually going to ask you.
Yeah.
because that's a very good point. And so, for anyone who might not know, I'll give you like a little brief. When these greenhouse gases are trapped, basically it traps in the warmth, and it warms the inside of it, warms our planet. It traps all the heat that comes from the sun, and it traps it in, just like a greenhouse. So anything that would exist naturally would be trapped anyway, but we create so much that it becomes trapped and it can't escape, and so we just start warming accelerated. It starts accelerating. And like you said, which I also don't think people might not realize, is that it's not about stopping climate change, it's about slowing climate change, because we can't stop it. We can't stop it, especially not at this point, but we can slow it, right?
Yeah. You're absolutely right. I mean, I think it's important to remember that there are natural greenhouse gases out there. The most abundant one is water vapor, which people don't really think about. And I mean, that contributes to, I think it's something like a third or a half of all greenhouse gases up there, but it's not, as potent as carbon dioxide. But we need greenhouse gases. We need, as what you said, the greenhouse effect to actually warm the planet and make it livable for us. Otherwise, it would be too cold. But the issue is the rate at which humans have caused and are continuing to cause that greenhouse effect to just go into overdrive. To the point where we're seeing in some desert climes, especially around the world, upwards of 40, 45 degrees centigrade on a daily basis. People, wildfires, people reporting the fact that they, have to wear gloves to touch their door handles to get into their own homes, because it's so hot at certain periods of the day. And, appreciably, some of those anecdotes, but also we have temperature records in those cities and countries to support this, are somewhat temporary in that it will spike one year, but then not get necessarily as hot in another year, and that's called climate variability. Right, so it's climate change and climate variability. But on a whole, the trend has been, for over 100 years, very clearly warming in both the atmosphere and in the upper levels of our oceans.
Right, which is also an issue we can get to, because that's an issue for us for sure, right? So, okay, we'll move on a little bit into how it's kind of affecting us. So, island nations, like ourselves, what are the threats it poses? So obviously you just mentioned the ocean warming, which has a bunch of different effects, right? What are the main things for us? We have our hurricanes, we have our weather patterns, we have our... what are the main threats? So I don't want to keep talking right now.
No, you're absolutely right. There are so many. So it's sort of hard to know where to start. But if we did start with the oceans and what's in our oceans, particularly, we're blessed with our wonderful, beautiful coral reefs that people travel from thousands of miles away and spend we do know how much money they spend here to see and partake of them and appreciate them. As well as all the biodiversity that's on our reefs, and into our coastal lagoons and elsewhere. And so that's a very important part of not just our life here and our identity as island peoples, but obviously our marine and coastal tourism resources, our recreational resources that we can't forget about, which contributes to our overall well-being, especially coming out of a period of COVID. I think everybody probably appreciates more our beaches and our reefs, and the fact that we can still go out and be able to for the most part, catch, the fish and the other species that we have been, that we've been able to catch for generations. And hopefully we'll continue to do so. But that's kind of what I'm talking about. These are aspects of our lives that can be impacted by stronger hurricanes, which is what's predicted. Maybe not necessarily more frequent storms, but when we have storms, they will more than likely be stronger in terms of wind intensity and the amount of rainfall. And I think we even saw that in the last few years with Hurricane Grace, Ida, perhaps maybe even Ian. I was off island for that one, but I did see the pictures that were coming into me, even in my neighborhood, which is a low-lying area. So we have to start thinking about, obviously, the main things that we hear about every hurricane season: fortifying our properties, our homes, our businesses. If you do own a business, having a business continuity plans, that sort of thing. But also in terms of going back to the actual natural resources that help to protect, especially coastal property and coastal infrastructure, our coral reefs. And we know that they take a beating, when it comes to hurricanes, and it takes, quite a long time for them to recover from damage caused by hurricanes. But whatever we can do as a community and as a nation to be able to ensure that they're as healthy as possible before they have to face that type of a threat, that we just can't go out there and hold our hands and say, nope, stop hurricane, go somewhere else. We can't do that. But we can give our reefs and our reef systems a helping hand by obviously observing the marine conservation laws, and just being responsible users of our natural environment on a whole, not just our reefs, but everything. Yeah, because it all works together. It's
all very
linked, right?
Yeah. And I think that was, we just recently had I think that was last year, we had our risk assessment, our climate risk assessment come back. I remember that, and I remember there was, at the end, they had a summary of kind of the three main risks that was identified by local and regional experts here. One being the disruption of turtle distribution and their population dynamics. One being a decline in coral reef structure and integrity, as you mentioned, and then one being an increased frequency and severity of coral bleaching and coral disease outbreaks, which is all what you just said, right? All the things that make turtles a part of our culture, a part of our natural habitat, part of the way of reefs work, right? And hurricane blockades, essentially, right? So these are the main threats to us. So what are we doing right now as a nation to mitigate them?
Well, yeah, I did want to highlight at the end that this is the sort of, we call it the glossy version that's on the ministry's microsite that deals primarily with the climate change risk assessment and information about the draft climate change policy that will be up there in the very near future, which talks about some of the things that we can do to mitigate not just those risks, but the other 47 odd risks that were identified, although we're primarily only looking at a subset of those that have been identified with a good level of confidence to be ones that we really should be focusing on in over the next decade for sure, but then building out from there as well, because we don't want to be sort of caught with our pants down if we don't look at certain things. And of course the policy will talk about how often it will be reviewed and that sort of thing to hone in on whether some of the risks that were identified before as just being moderate should now be upgraded, for example, to be severe. So we have 18 severe risks that primarily the climate change policy looks at. But yeah, so there are things like what we were sort of starting to talk about before in terms of ensuring that our natural assets are valued, are protected as best as possible, and whether that's through legislation or policy or just good stewardship on a day-to-day basis by you, me, and everybody else that lives here and utilizes them, and in ways that you might not realize you utilize them through the ecosystem services that they provide to us, like you said, whether they help regulate our climate or whether they help protect our coastal property, or whether they're a provisioning type of service. So the fish that provide us with food, that provide us with an angling or sporting industry or sector of that tourism economy that people rely on, so that we can continue to have angling events that bring boaters and anglers to our shores. buffers each year, that sort of thing. So it's those types of policy levers that we're looking at, but it's also things that we may need to invest in a little bit more, not just in terms of what I think people generally tend to think of when they think of addressing the impacts of climate change, and particularly hurricanes, like, we have to build more sea defenses, so more sea walls. So there may be definitely a need to look at that further. We did that in some areas along the coast after Hurricane Ivan, for example. But it would be surely preferable if there are natural buffers in place, be they coral reefs, seagrass meadows, extensive seagrass meadows, mangrove areas, that can help us with the buffering of some of these waves and storm surges and wind-driven wave action that what we tend to say is create a greater envelope of water that comes onto our beaches and our shores and impacts, our property. But it's not just that. It's other, I want to say, sort of lesser thought of or softer type of interventions where we may not fully, like you said, appreciate, because we can't necessarily see these things, but what's happening around the rest of the world that might be impacting us or might have an impact on us, particularly in terms of other areas for tourism destinations that might open up because they are becoming warmer. So it might not necessarily be that people want to travel to the hot, humid Caribbean.
I've never thought about that.
So, but, likewise in mountain regions, they're finding that, there's some years that they don't have a lot of snow. So those mountainous ski resorts, they're suffering on the different end of the spectrum there. Versus, our financial services sector, where we're seeing, and I'm not a financial services expert by any stretch of the imagination, but we're trying to get a firmer grasp on climate risks to that sector. But then the global financial system on a whole, not only in terms of the physical risks that we sort of spoke about, where the brick and mortar banks and that sort of thing are, but also in terms of the transitional risks that globally are everybody's trying to wrap their heads around, particularly when it comes to countries putting in their net zero policies and transitioning off of fossil fuels, so decarbonizing the investment portfolios, that sort of thing. And what does that trickle down, mean to places that typically rely on some of these, high-level investments for building of infrastructure that has typically been carbon intensive, and is there a way to transition some of those funds that used to go to those carbon intensive sectors or projects to adaptation, to reducing the vulnerability of small islands, low-lying countries, less developed countries and communities, those that have indigenous populations that have been disadvantaged for generations, that sort of thing. So I'm rushing through it, but I'm just trying to give you sort of like the broad strokes of other climate risks that people may not generally tend to think of. And like you said, some of them are quite remote from a small island perspective, but the cascading impact could be felt or seen here just because of the mere fact that we do have tourism as an extremely climate sensitive sector, but we also heavily rely upon our financial services sector to carry us through things that don't have anything to do with climate, like the COVID shock and other sort of economic recessions in other countries that that have trickled down to having impacts on us one way or another. So this is what we talk about when we say that everything kind of nowadays has to be looked at through a climate change lens, because what's already an issue for us may continue to be an issue for us if we don't have, those things sorted out. But apply climate change on top of that, it may or may not, worsen the situation, but it just may worsen it, and we need to have an understanding of how much more, so those things will get exacerbated as a result of climate change for us. And let's think ahead of how we can either head those off at the pass or be able to make our social systems, economic systems, natural systems much more resilient to those shocks and be able to not just bounce back, but hopefully bounce forward in a more, sort of regenerative way than we've been doing in the past.
Right, and so you mentioned global north earlier, because one thing that I also do hear a lot sometimes when just talking to anybody, who might not know much about climate change or anything, which is fine, right? That's the point of the podcast, guys. The point is to learn more about it. But they might say, well, why is this our problem? And as you mentioned the global north, right? And I just wonder if you could explain what that is, number one. And then number two, why it is important for them to take responsibility, whoever, this body of the global north is, we are vulnerable as an island nation to the activities of the global north. But then when you look at being the 25th highest country, including industrialized nations in the world, just us, is number 25 out of how many countries? 195 countries, and we're number 25. Like, we definitely have responsibilities, right? So we can't say, but this isn't our problem. So I wonder if you could just explain what the global north is, but then why it is relevant to us here to make the change, because being 25th country in the world, right? So, yeah, just explain that if you could.
That I guess really comes out of 25, 30 years of United Nations sustainable development and climate change negotiations. That's a term that's often used, and it's kind of antiquated now because the lines of division and delineation as to who is north and who is south anymore. I mean, it used to just bare bones represent northern hemisphere from southern hemisphere. Right. Yeah. Essentially the equator, but so slightly north of that. Yeah, give or take. And yes, because primarily the countries of the world that we think of today as the industrialized or advanced economies or developed nations, kind of got there on the backs and the natural resources and the labor of people that they either had as colonies, or where a lot of their main basis of either extraction or production was located in the quote-unquote global south, which, left those areas impoverished, and still to this day struggling with generational poverty and huge debt that, the nations carry, that they either have to repay at, exorbitant interest rates or what have you, or come under some sort of, IMF structural adjustment system to, pay back all of that debt. So it comes out of all of that sort of developmental economics but yes, it did get transferred over into, like I said, the climate change framework and that sort of thing, because back in 1992, the Rio Earth Summit and all of that discussion was taking place at the time. So you'll even see in the Kyoto Protocol that falls out of the Climate Change Convention, which is now several decades old and is sunsetting because we now have the Paris Agreement that's taking over the post-2020 climate change or climate action agenda. You'll even see in the Kyoto Protocol where they talk about economies in transition, and most of those had been like the Eastern European bloc, post-Soviet Union era, that type of thing. Some of them have done very well, but in the convention itself, because the convention is now so dated, they may be considered still developing countries rather than developed countries, even though their economies, speak to them being, with the GDP, how we tend to measure economic progress, GDP per capita. So that then comes in some ways to your question about the Cayman Islands and where we generally tend to rank in terms of per capita carbon emissions. I would just say, yes, it's something that we address not only in the climate change, we hope to address in the climate change policy, but also the national energy policy that's under review as well this year. But it's something that you should just be mindful of how you read statistics sometimes, and just be a little informed in terms of where the raw data is coming from in order to, to understand how they've ranked us. So it's not to say that, we're doing much better than 25 or worse, but it's just sometimes that information tends to be old. It tends to be maybe from the World Bank, and they use the CIA book data for that. So it's not necessarily data that they get from the countries themselves. It's just whatever they can find at the time. And sometimes it is. Sometimes they do reach out to the Economics and Statistics Office or whatever statistics office in the country. But it is fair to say that at least for us, we know what our per capita emissions are, because one of the things that we have to produce on an annual basis, as we're an affiliate party to the Climate Change Convention and the Kyoto Protocol, is our greenhouse gas inventory. And we provide that information to the compilers of the UK's inventory, because we fall under the UK, as do other overseas territories that have asked to be signed up to these conventions and protocols, and the Crown dependencies as well. So we have a fairly good idea as to our overall greenhouse gas emissions and the breakdown per sector, whether it's from waste, so the manure management and, what our cattle and so forth are producing, or whether it's from our, of course, major contributor, which is our power sector, energy sector.
Is that 15? That's the latest number,
So we have a more recent inventory than that, and we're actually just waiting for the 2021 one to come in now, because it's always a bit delayed, that they report to the UNFCCC Secretariat. But in 2019, I believe the overall greenhouse gas footprint was somewhere around 17.1, and of that, 15 point something was carbon dioxide.
I gotcha.
Right. Yeah. So that's a good point. That's another thing to always sort of bear in mind when people are talking about carbon. Are they talking about carbon? Are they talking about carbon dioxide? Or are they talking about all greenhouse gas emissions, which generally tends to be captured as CO2e or CO2 equivalent? So then you know that it's talking about all gases. It's talking about CO2. It's talking about methane, nitrous oxide, the 3 F gases, or the 4 F gases now that we report under the Kyoto Protocol and the Doha Amendment to that Kyoto Protocol.
Interesting. So it's always, we can say 25th in the world, but it depends what you're talking about, right? It depends. You're talking about carbon, or are you talking about?
But we are high. We are high for a country our size, and a lot of that is to do with the quality of life, the standard of living that we have here, which, we're very fortunate for and very thankful of. But it's how we produce, like I said before, how we produce our energy that turns our lights on reliably every day, pretty much. That's the majority of our emissions nationally, as well as on an individual basis. The second most emission source for us are our transportation emissions. And I think it's no surprise when we think of the traffic congestion, particularly on Grand Cayman and coming from the eastern districts every day and every evening, single-use vehicles, and the fact that we need to build out our public transportation system, which hopefully more people would use if they find it to be a more reliable source, and yeah. Great. So there are things that we know that we need to be doing collectively, and what also culturally makes sense for us and physically makes sense for islands. You have a lot of people that talk about different things that they see in either other island nations that may be bigger, or other jurisdictions that aren't islands that work for them. But do those sorts of things work for us? So that those are the considerations that we have to take into play here. But then, yes, the next contributor down, I believe, on the inventory would be things like our waste and handling our waste management, and that's not just solid waste, like I said, but also in terms of agricultural waste and that sort of thing. So it's every sector that we need to look at, every aspect, again, like our climate risk, every aspect of our lives and how we're producing these emissions. But obviously some are some activities are much more emissions generating than others, and those are the ones that obviously we should concentrate on first and foremost.
And as you said, we're all sharing the same atmosphere, right? Yeah. So regardless of who's, I guess, responsible for the biggest changes in terms of climate change, or everybody has a part to play. And you actually mentioned public transport, which leads us kind of into this kind of next question about the importance of our mangroves. We've mentioned mangroves a few times. We've mentioned them for, our little battle station to beat the waves, everything like that. But right now our mangroves are slightly at risk. We do have some parts, obviously, saved, and the National Trust have saved certain parts of mangroves and stuff, but mangroves are important, and seagrass, both, are an important carbon sink, right? So they capture and they absorb carbon in the air, if we're just talking about the carbon aspect of climate change. So I guess my question is the potential for this new EWA road. What effects could that have? That climate change and biodiversity go hand in hand, right? So what effects could we see as a result of this new road, which has been debated on whether it would make a positive impact or not, right? I think we're waiting for a bit more information on that. But what would that have on our climate change issues here? Would that affect the way that our weather works?
Well, I think any major capital project, whether it's a road, a port, a new town somewhere, a school or business complex, I think we have to start looking at all of these major developments and major infrastructural projects, and even on a smaller scale as well, on an individual basis, where you're building your house. Exactly that. Yeah. Where are these things being proposed? Where are they being located in our islands? Not just Grand Cayman, but our sister islands as well. Because of just, the realities of it being a small landmass, but also, like you said, in terms of the competing land uses that are either there or surrounding where these projects are being proposed. Some of them are mangroves, which of course are important, like you said, for carbon sinks. So that's one of the sort of regulating functions that we talked about earlier, but also as protection from storms, so provisioning services. But there's also, our dry forests, which are equally important from a biodiversity point of view, maybe lesser so for storing and sequestering carbon, but they still have value there. And that's what I was talking about earlier, about ensuring that we've properly, adequately valued our natural assets, which we have started to do now under our natural capital accounts. That is going through yet another iteration. The third iteration, and really utilizing those bits of information and data in proper climate risk assessments, and whether they're part of or complementary to environmental impact assessments, cost-benefit analyses, any other kind of risk management framework, which frankly we should be doing anyway, right? And making sure that we have all the information in hand as best as possible, from not just climate scientists, not just from ecologists and transportation planners and architects and engineers and the whole gamut of stakeholders that produce either a good project or should have a say in what goes into a good, sustainable, climate resilient, low carbon. Yes, buzzwords, but they mean something. They And that's why a lot of these frameworks now really try to hone in on what do those mean, what's the criteria, whether you really want to test it out to the point where you get third-party verification from an international independent body for some of these things, such as, green building certifications and that sort of thing, which can be done for homes, but entire neighborhoods, entire campuses, and, other types of certification systems for even infrastructural projects that utilize, for example, in a mangrove area, elevated bridges, elevated, walkways, in order to be able to preserve the hydrology, of the area. Or, again, whatever the existing considerations are for that area that you might want to apply if it's not a mangrove area. Because like I said, mangroves are important, but, that's not the only important natural area or biome. Our freshwater resources as well, and our freshwater aquatic habitats, would they become more salinated as a result of sea level rise? Yes. Would we want to exacerbate that by bringing seawater closer to those areas as a result of a road or a canal or a marina coming further inland? These are all the considerations that we have to think of. The projects in and of themselves may not necessarily be bad, but where they are being proposed is the issue. So, yeah, definitely the application of a climate risk assessment to, those types of projects, because at the end of the day, even if it wasn't climate risk, it was just, like I said before, maybe a decision that, should have been sort of looked at with much more scrutiny. From a sustainable development point of view, it's much more costly to try and remediate something once it's happened. And in some cases, yes, in terms of natural resources and natural assets, it's almost impossible to replant. And even if you did, the benefits of that replanting might not even be reaped by you and I in our lifetime. It might be another 2 generations down the line, which is why many cultures around the world look at, and they happen to be indigenous cultures or Aboriginal cultures that have continued to have quite a close connection with the environment around them, with Mother Earth, or whatever they happen to call her, or it, because it goes by so many different names. They really have this ingrained into their cultural psyche, and they really do make these decisions as best as possible, for not just here and now, that type of short-termism, not even for 1 or 2 generations that they will hopefully see as in their great-grandkids, but they really do tend to think of it much more long-term, in terms of some of the decisions that they're making, and really what they consider to be stewardship of their environment, because their lives have been so intricately linked to, the environment around them and the world in which they live, because they have not necessarily been people that have the means to import goods and services from elsewhere, so they have to rely upon what they can get around them for their day-to-day existence. When you're that much more removed from those processes, I think you don't probably appreciate them that much until you maybe come to try to be a backyard gardener and find out, how difficult and crushing it is, when your peppers haven't survived because, it's too hot, or conversely, you didn't adequately protect them from the deluge of rainfall that, you got in one event. And again, that's,
And those are, again, micro things that you might not notice or even realize.
Right.
But then you might stop to think, okay, next year, March, or next year, September, whatever, maybe I should pull these in. Maybe I should cover this with plastic, or, maybe I shouldn't try these seeds again because I didn't have much success, so it is, for me anyway, it's a trial and error. But, I think when people start to think along those lines, then they think, oh yeah, I do see something happening with the weather, or, fisher folk in particular, if they're not getting the catch that they used to get, when they were kids in particular, but even maybe say 5-10 years ago, or they have to go further afield using, more gasoline in their boats, just to catch the same thing. Or if they're water sports operators and they're finding that they have to go to, different areas or further away to have their guests, experience what they used to experience, but didn't take, like you said, as long to get there, or whatever. I think if people really thought about their day-to-day goings about, they would be able to say, oh yeah, that is different from when I grew up here, or yeah, that is different from when I first moved to the islands, you know?
Well, yeah, it's all encompassing, really, and then we're all so interconnected, and in terms of how we look after and steward these incredibly important areas is something that people need to take into consideration and think about. And so I guess we can kind of end on that. I know you guys have a public consultation coming up, right? So I just wondered if you could tell us a bit about that, and then like what would be some of the easiest ways that people could kind of start making a difference, do you think, themselves?
Right, yeah. So hopefully by mid-April, so I guess after the Easter break, everybody can enjoy their Easter. You may be hearing more about the public consultations for the updated climate change policy, which we're putting the finishing touches on now. And they will hopefully be able to attend the public meetings that we will be having in all 5 districts in Grand Cayman, as well as in Little Cayman and Cayman Brac. So I would just say to stay tuned to social media, particularly the ministry's social media and government in general, in terms of what, you know, when those dates are, the venues for those meetings, and there'll be an opportunity obviously there and then to be able to feed back to the ministry staff and the whole group of departments that fall under our ministry that are going to be there to be able to answer questions, but also to the digital feedback form that we will have on the website, which if any of your listeners out there are interested to already take a look at some of the background information to this, like the climate change risk assessment that we spoke about. Yeah, so that's gov.ky/sustainability/climate change policy, all one word. And also on that site, just to note, there are some of the resources that I mentioned, some of the IPCC reports and fact sheets that deal just with small islands or just with the Caribbean that people might be interested in. As well as regional body reports, State of the Caribbean Report 2020, that's a good one to look at. Cayman is actually referenced in some of the modeling information there, and then some of the background details to the old climate change policy and where we've come since then. So that's the public consultation. There'll be much more on that, I think, as we build out the communications plan. And yes, I'd say stay tuned to listen to that. And just another thing about the climate change hub at the moment, well, we're calling it the microsite for the ministry at the moment, but we hope that it will be a climate change hub, that it will be sort of your one-stop shop for, I wouldn't like to say all things climate change, but I would like to say all things climate change, certainly in the Cayman Islands. And it's not going to happen overnight, but for it to be that sort of clearinghouse that you can go to for information about climate change in general, so at the global level, IPCC report type level, regionally, and linked to the resources that you can find at the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center out of Belize, who we've worked along with in the past and very generously lent their expertise to the first climate change policy, the 2011 policy, and the vulnerability and capacity assessment that we did back then, and the technical report. But also to, you know, things that are very Cayman specific, which we do have resources. They're not up yet, but we do have some of the resources from that initiative back in 2007 to 2011, but also, you know, other peer-reviewed papers that have been produced either by myself or, you know, members of the Department of Environment or what have you, and other, you know, other things that have been written that we may not yet know about. So if there are things out there, master's theses, that sort of thing, that, you know, individuals would like to share with us, that's sort of the idea that we would hope that this hub will eventually grow into. And so I would just say, yes, watch this space and see what much more it can provide to the wider community, businesses, that sort of thing, in terms of what people can do, you know, helpful guide books and fact sheets and that sort of things. Yeah.
It doesn't have to be super hard, right?
Exactly.
It can come
Just
down.
The little day-to-day things, as we always say, if all of us are doing something, then the needle will be moved.
Exactly. And my whole environmental journey, myself, I start learning the bigger things that I can do to protect the island. Like, I know I can do the little things. I know I can switch my lights off. I know I can carpool. I know I can, maybe eat less meat and stop contributing, that way and stuff like that. But then I look at things like our mangroves and I go, I think the ISBC report? IPC report. I know they mentioned that one of the best ways to fix climate change or to help slow climate change is to protect our forests and our mangroves. And so I go, look at a road like the EWA. Like, do we need it? Do we need to think about it? Things like that. Like, those are the bigger changes. But I think everybody starts small. Start small and understand that you have a say in it, right? Because it's your future. It's quite literally linked to your future and your kids and their kids and everybody to come. So thank you so much for coming in to kind of give us a base today.
You're welcome.
I hope everybody feels like they have some ground to work with. Lots of ground. I feel like I have lots of ground now. You're a busy lady. We'll let you go.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's been a great pleasure speaking with you, and I'd love to come back.
Oh, well, we'll have you back. We'll have you back after the public consultation, because I'm sure it'd be really interesting to hear what people on our island have to say about it and what they want from it, right? So that'll be super interesting. Well, thank you so much again to yourself and to DMS Broadcasting and Bobo 89.1 FM and my pal Ryan Kirklady here from Retrospekt Media for capturing all of this. A big thank you to Sustainable Cayman for sponsoring this episode of the podcast. And remember, Sustainable Cayman is a nonprofit organization promoting conservation and environmental sustainability to create a flourishing, natural environment and healthy communities. You can follow them on Instagram at SustainableKY and on Facebook at sustainable.cayman. Also, make sure to check out their Facebook group, Wetlands Thrive, Life Survives, and their cool jingle competition that's on right now. You can win a little bit of money for that, and make a lasting contribution. So make sure to check out our filmed episodes over on YouTube and follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Protecting Paradise KY. And remember, you cannot care unless you know. So now you've got your base of information. Go out there and do something with it, and we will see you next week.